Hello, everybody, and welcome to this live session brought to you by Teaching English with the British Council. I'm Hamdan, and today I'm here with two great speakers, Sue and Fiona. I'll put them on the stage.
Hi.
Hi,
Hi,
everybody.
Sue. Hi, Fiona. So Sue and Fiona wrote an amazing piece of research, and it's around global practices of teaching English to young learners. And in this piece of research, they compare results from 2010 with results that they got from 2020 around teaching young learners. So they are here with us today, and you can ask them any questions. You can leave these questions in the comment section. If you had a look at the research, you can ask specific questions. And if not, you can, of course, ask any question you want. Just to get this talk starting, please tell us where you are watching from also. We'd love to know where you're watching. So maybe we can start with you, Sue, and Fiona, maybe telling us a little bit about maybe what you found or what has changed from 2010 until 2020.
Who's going to do that one?
Carry on.
I go, all right, I said. I'd like to say
Or maybe it has a lot changed. Or
no, I was going to say surprisingly little, or perhaps not surprisingly little. I think if you've actually read the report, you'll see that actually we found, I don't think, it's not fair to say that nothing's changed. Things have changed a bit, but I think they've changed more in emphasis rather than in substance. I think maybe Fiona would agree with that.
Yeah.
So we find that particularly a lot of the challenges that primary school teachers faced, and I should probably just say at this point, we were concerned with teaching English in primary schools, in state schools, rather than in the private sector or in private language schools. So it's mainly state schools. The challenges have changed very little since 2010. And these include things like discipline, differentiation, training or lack of training, lack of confidence in teachers' own language ability, large classes, a range of challenges which have remained very much the same. They may have kindly slightly moved in the rankings, if you like, but they're still very much the same challenges. And in fact, we even have a relatively new project now called Future of English, and we're finding exactly the same challenges still in that as well. Do you want to? I
just think that affects how people, what people can actually do in the classroom. Yeah. So rather than, an ideal view of, wouldn't it be lovely if we could do, pair work, group work, dance, drama, all these lovely activities. In fact, the constraints and the challenges of the classroom mean that many of these things are just not possible. And so teachers tend to teach in quite a traditional way, whole class teaching from the front, fairly standard activities with more traditional activities, singing, games and so on woven in, but then not so much the mainstay of what happens in the classroom, but a little bits of added extra to make the children remain engaged.
I think one of the things we've really come to realize over the 10 years is how important it is that actually we have to value what teachers. What we found is teachers are very often criticized because they don't match that ideal situation, but actually the circumstances, the context in which teachers are working in mean that they can't. So we believe that it's really important to value what teachers do and look at what teachers do well and look at what teachers do effectively. Because from both projects, from 2010 and 2020, we saw some very effective teaching that responded to the constraints and the challenges that teachers were finding.
Yeah, and a lot of it sometimes is influenced by policy. So a certain policy can really affect how teachers act in the class, or certain practices that they are used to doing or not doing. I remember one of them is maybe 10 years ago, it was like frowned upon if you speak your home language in the class, or speak to young learners in their home language. But I think now more and more research is supporting that at a younger age.
I think the research is, but that's not necessarily filtering through to schools and classrooms, where teachers are still very often told that, you know, they should have an English only classroom. I think there's a big gap between the research and what actually happens on the ground.
Between the practice. And, you know, if policy, going back to policy, if policy is stating English only, or, you know, there's quite often you get this this instruction, English wherever possible, and only resort to the children's languages if you have to, rather than thinking about the children's languages as a resource to teach English. Because basically what's happening is English is being taught as a school subject in a primary classroom. It's not being taught as a communicative use. Children aren't exposed to English every day of their lives, you know, 24 hours a day. It's something that they're learning. And, you know, in order to learn something, you draw upon your resources to do that. And one of the resources children and teachers have is the language, their other languages. And if you ban those from the classroom, then you're taking away something that could be supportive to them. But what we found is that we've worked with lots of teachers and teacher trainers who you know, still have this misapprehension about using other languages in the class, and somehow think it's wrong. But
And also I think there's a misapprehension. I mean, there's a gap between the practices as well. I mean, most curricular policy documents will talk about communicative language teaching, will talk about whatever communicative language teaching means these days, talk about competence-based curricula or whatever it is. But the situation teachers they have to adapt to the context in which they find themselves. And that's very often, at least previously, a lot of research criticised, you know, there was this gap between the policy and practice, and how do teachers move towards the policy? Well, actually, they can't, because of the situation and the constraints they find themselves in. So let's look at what they can do effectively within those constraints in which they find themselves, and start really valuing what they do, rather than saying, oh, you should be doing something different that actually you can't do.
Yeah, and sometimes the curriculum's documents, as a document, it just looks very ambitious to the reality in the class, you know.
Yeah, that's another huge problem, I think. You know, teachers and children, you know, are set up to fail, really, because the expectations are so high. And, you know, the idea that language is learnt by covering a course book, you know, which is still quite prevalent, I think, amongst policymakers and maybe parents as well. So what is actually possible? I mean, one of the things we found in our recent research is this kind of pattern of what teachers do. So they go into class, there's some sort of welcome, there's maybe a song, then there's a review maybe of the last lesson, then there's some presentation of something, there's a bit of practice, and that's the end of the class. So what you can actually do in that time is very, very limited, but that isn't really recognised as widely as it ought to be, so that people, teachers and children, you know, are allowed to feel, well, that's enough, rather than they're not ever doing well enough.
I think because I can see in the chat we've got people from all over the world, and it'd be really interesting to hear if what we're saying resonates and reflects your experiences.
Yeah, and you know, yesterday, 2 days ago, my colleague Naomi had a community question to our teachers on the page. And the question reads, since you first started teaching, how has your teaching changed? We've got some really interesting answers. A lot of teachers saying how much their teaching has changed because it's a progressive effort, or they're gaining more skills or trying to learn about more methodologies. Let me read out some of the comments.
Okay.
So we have Rashna, who says, very progressive effort in my way of teaching, now more passionate, tolerant, patient, and caring towards the learners. More equality, equity, and fairness among learners are established. Emphasis on classroom rules. Can control the children through activities and games, encourage them to mingle. Another comment by Akif, he says, I used to work on a teacher-centered approach, but with the passage of time through different trainings, I switched to activity-based teaching and learner-centered approaches. We have also Ramoto, who says, teaching has changed a lot. Before, we used to teach the essential knowledge, grammar, vocabulary, speech, in isolation, but now they are taught in context. The workload has reduced and regrouped into real-life situation, which later facilitate teaching and learning in classroom setting. Do you think, Sue and Fiona, that teachers are moving away from teacher-centered approaches and following more communicative approaches, or is that what you found in your research, or is it different?
I think teachers will do things that might be considered communicative, such as there'll be a song or a bit of role play, or some other activity, maybe some pair work or group work. More group work than pair work we've seen.
Yeah.
But they're not the organising principle of the classroom. They're sort of woven in to a more traditional teacher-fronted approach. But rather than criticising the teacher-fronted approach, I think our view is that often in the time frame available, with the number of students in the class and the level of English that the children have, what the teachers are doing is actually very appropriate to that context, and they will keep the class together so that the class is a kind of community of learning, rather than splitting them up into groups or pairs where they may lose control, where they don't really know what the children are doing. And that's particularly true, I think, when the classes are large, but we can also see it when classes are small as well.
Yeah, I think
perhaps we need to move away from this dichotomy between teacher-fronted and communicative, as if one was good and one was bad. I know there was a suggestion, I can't remember the reference, it is in the report, that we should start to see activities, but activities on a continuum between teacher-fronted and communicative.
Beaumont and somebody.
Is it? Thank you. But that's not to say, but we're not, we're very keen to make the point that we're not saying that one is better than the other. What we're saying is different activities are appropriate at different times in different contexts. And that's where teachers, I think, really, rather than trying to take any kind of agency away from teachers and say, you should be doing this, and making them feel bad or guilty because actually they can't, is being far more trusting of teachers who do adapt. They have to adapt to the context in which they find themselves, because they have no choice. And they do it very well in our experience.
And sometimes it's also culture, like in certain cultures, the perception of teachers is maybe different than other cultures. So that's why you'd find the teacher like in the front of the class, but it's not necessarily a bad thing.
No,
absolutely not. There is a comment in the chat there that in Yemen, there is no teaching.
Yeah, that's
talking about teaching strategies is a luxury.
It becomes a luxury,
From Ahmed, who says, you might not know that teachers here in Yemen became unable to continue in this job due to economic problems. Although I am a teacher, I am really scared that my children might not find someone to teach them. Talking about teaching strategies became like trying to buy a luxury car.
Yeah, and I don't think that's necessarily unusual globally. We've done some work in Mexico, and the teachers I don't know if anybody here is listening today from Mexico, we were specifically down in Oaxaca, and the teachers are hired on a kind of almost termly basis, and they're never sure whether they're going to have a job. And so, but they've got to hang around waiting to see if this job is going to appear. And then they might do a few hours at this school and a few hours at the other school. So it can be very precarious, I think, as a profession, English language teaching. And that's maybe one thing that has been good about the rise of English in primary teaching in a state environment, paid for by the state, because then you would hope that teachers were going to be getting more terms and conditions, although that doesn't always apply, obviously. But it still remains precarious, as the colleague from Yemen tells us.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a comment there as well that it totally resonates, because one of the challenges is to use our time effectively. Many times classes are 50 to 60 minutes and classes are large. What can you do in that time? And then it becomes a case of how can you best use that time? And I think that's the point we're really trying to get across. Both from this is the same in 2010 and 2020, and the same in our current projects. Let's have a look at what teachers can do effectively under the conditions they're working in, and that includes resources, it includes infrastructure, it includes class size, time, educational culture.
We've been, I think there's been a tendency to sort of try almost to de-skill teachers, to say what they're doing isn't good enough and what they should be doing is this other set of skills. And in fact, many teachers, they've been students themselves all their lives, and they've absorbed a lot of skill, and they kind of know what works in the context. And, those skills, we've seen some fantastic, huge class teaching over the last few years, with skills that wouldn't normally be shouted about in the literature as things that teachers should be doing. So as Sue says, I think there's an opportunity at the moment to re-evaluate whole class teaching and how that's done effectively, to complement, like she said, we don't want to take one thing away and put another thing in its place. That's not going to help anybody, but to re-evaluate pedagogies for young learners, because that is very much in a junior state at the moment. Teaching children English in state schools in particular is quite a recent global phenomenon.
Relatively,
And, I don't think we've really cracked it about what we should be doing in those classrooms. And so I think that we've still got a lot to learn. Teachers have got so much to contribute to those conversations, because they're the ones in the classroom every day doing that work. So, researching your classroom, seeing what works, and helping us to understand more about classrooms, I think is probably the way to go over the next few years.
Yeah, and in the research, you also mentioned that more teachers are using, for example, things like videos, which were not popular in the past.
That's an interesting development.
Technology, do you think there's more?
I think it is technology.
I think it's just more available. I think it's just more available than it was.
I mean, when you think of the old days when we were at school, they would wheel in this television on a big trolley thing, and if you were lucky to have a video, then and so it was a whole lot of kit in order to show a couple of minutes of something. Whereas nowadays, it's particularly in classrooms that have some classrooms globally are very well set up, and it's very easy just to click a link and show a bit of something. I mean, we do that in our teaching all the time as well. But even in, resource poorer contexts, technologically, we've seen teachers bring in speakers into the classroom to play bits of text. And, so it's possible, much more possible in most classrooms now than it was 15 years ago even.
That was a really interesting switch, I think, between 2010 and 2020, because whereas we asked the question in the survey, we asked the question, what would most improve your teaching? And there were 8 options, I think. And one was more access to technology, and one was better resources. I can't remember exactly how it was, but it was something like that. So in 2010, better access to technology was much higher up than better resources, whereas in 2020 it had sort of gone the other way around. So it's almost like, I think in 2010 people were thinking, oh, if I only had this technology, everything would be wonderful. And then in 2020 they have got the technology, but then they perhaps start to realize that actually, you know, the course book's perhaps not as good as they thought it was, or suddenly the course book becomes more important. So, you know, there's more attention because now I've got the technology.
Yeah, and it's also more problems rising, like that comment I showed on the screen, which says the attention span of learners is shorter. Or there's this comment as well from Georgie, who says, I think in the time of AI, it is ever more important to prioritize relationship and personalization to reach learners.
And that's something we found. We found that personalization was a technique, a strategy that teachers used a lot. So, you know, when they're doing the question and answers that Fiona was talking about, they would actually refer to local contexts. So in Africa, we saw, in Malawi, we saw a class where the teacher was asking about the seasons and when, you know, to do a Q&A, sort of the seasons and when seeds are sown and which is the wet season and which is the dry season. So it was very personalized. They used a lot of the local context to actually teach the content, to teach the language.
Well, yeah, another thing that we found, I think that's, we were just chatting before we started this talk, is the growing awareness of children with special educational needs and disabilities. That I think that's a growing awareness globally. And then, you know, how do we respond to that? You know, because it becomes even more of a challenge in these contexts that we're discussing, of large classes, few resources. You know, we're not always in classrooms where there are 2 or 3 classroom assistants to support those children. So I think it's going to be very interesting how that awareness creates new pedagogies going forward to support all children in the classroom, in a way that maybe hasn't been quite so prevalent till now.
And I think maybe with the technologies now, it's easier maybe to adapt certain tasks to make them for, you know, different learners, like using maybe AI to adapt certain lessons or activities too.
Yes, the role that AI is going to play. There was also a comment in the chat about social media and sort of the importance of social media. And I think one of the points, I mean, we're talking about young learners here. We're talking about primary school children. So we are talking, not to say that they don't go on social media. I'm sure they do. But one of the things I think with young learners is that there's far more access to English outside the classroom than there ever used to be in many contexts, not in all contexts. And that's something we also have to remember, and not for all learners in all contexts. So things like, there's been quite a lot of work recently done around children gaming, you know, playing online games and communicating through English. So there is more of a kind of a potentially an external motivation in some contexts. But, you know, this inequality of access, I think, as we say in the report, this inequality of access, both across countries and within countries, is one of the biggest issues I think we face in English language teaching. Yeah,
it's totally underplayed. You know, the private language system, school system, and the private tutor system means that some children are getting unequal access because their parents can afford it. If you want another thing that creates unequal access is rural versus urban. So often children in, not always, but often if you're in an urban environment, you're more likely to be able to access English classes, access English outside the classroom. In some rural areas, it's very difficult to attract teachers for some of the reasons that are coming up in the chat. So, yeah, there's not all children are being treated the same, although one of the motivators for introducing English into primary school teachers, into primary school classrooms, was to level the playing field so that all children had access. but it's just not working like that. Some children are getting more access, and some children, the access still remains very limited. So I don't know if we're shoring up a problem for ourselves in the future with, you know, this inequality when it comes to English language learning.
And going back to Carlos' comment here, saying traditional to modern teaching has changed according to social reality. 21st century skills are the scaffoldings to create new methods of teaching. Even the pandemic forced teachers to create other methods for learning. PBL, flipped classroom, and other techniques are immersed the student into an active and independent process of learning.
That's really, because a lot of this research and our subsequent project were actually carried out during the pandemic. So we saw a lot of how teachers were having to adapt their teaching. I think it's perhaps more a case of different educational approaches rather than different methods of teaching English. At least that's what we've seen through the kind of shift to online learning. So different platforms, obviously. I'm not sure remember, we are talking about primary school here. We're talking about young children. We're not talking about adults or older learners. What we saw was much of the same type of teaching, but done on a different platform. So we were still seeing, you know, the Q&A, we were still seeing the teacher fronted, we were still seeing the translanguaging, but it was done obviously on a different platform, different kind of turn-taking allocations, the way children were invited to speak. It had to be teacher to student. It wasn't teacher to group. I don't think we never saw the children divided into groups, did we?
No. I think, I think Fido's, if I'm saying your name correctly, I apologise, comment there, as we well know, 80 countries are poorer. Well, at least 80 countries, you know, there's, you know, I don't think we necessarily understand, if we're in one of the richer countries, what teachers in the poorer countries, you know, for want of a better phrase, have to deal with. And it is a hugely different reality, which is another contributor to inequity in English language, because they just don't have the same resources as the teachers in, you know, more, you know, global north countries do. So I think, you know, as Fido says, you have to adapt what you've got, work with what you've got, rather than, you don't have the technology, you know, you don't have the computers, it's just not there. So what can you do instead?
And it may be, I don't think I think it's really important to make the point that having the technology does not make you a better teacher.
Yeah.
I mean, it might give you more options, it might give you more possibilities, but you're not necessarily a better teacher. I mean, we saw a brilliant lesson of storytelling in Malawi, where there's over 100 children in the class. They've got no technology at all. And the teacher had prepared a box. She'd cut out a box. She'd got a roll. She'd got paper on a roll with scenes from a story. And she told the children to watch the television. And they were all there looking at this box. And she was rolling the pictures while she was telling the story. So, I mean, that's just incredibly creative. She had no technology at all. And I'm not saying, and I don't think she would have done a better lesson had she had a computer. And in fact, might even have been worse if she'd been just putting the story on the computer and the children had been sitting there listening.
We saw a bit of that as well. Can I just respond to the question, the part there that somebody said that we're not native speakers?
Oh yeah.
I just don't think that matters at all.
It's not relevant.
You know, in fact, I think you're at an advantage if you know the children's language, whether you're a native speaker of English or not. I think that the key is that if you can use the children's language, you can do all those things that we've already been talking about, such as developing relationships, helping them to access the curriculum, which somebody who doesn't know the children's first language can't do. So I actually think even the level of English for teaching, because they're learning very little actually, and it's a very low level, teachers don't actually need that high level, I don't think, to teach English in the primary sector. What they need is enthusiasm and confidence and an empathy with the children, and to be good class managers and able to organise learning. And it's different kinds of skill set, but I wouldn't put native speakerism anywhere near the top of that.
No, not at all.
Especially I think for young learners, because they feel the empathy and like the atmosphere with the teacher more than anything else. So just this last comment saying, one of the greatest worry is how to go about balancing this improved learning process. Do you think there are maybe some lessons we can take away from, those changes from 2010 until the day? Are there any lessons that we need to be aware of?
I think teachers should feel confident. They're doing a great job. They're working in difficult circumstances. What is possible is limited, and it's not their fault or their children's fault if they can only manage, to create a bit of learning rather than a lot of learning. And, their efforts are appreciated. And, I think they are in control of the learning. And I think it's for researchers really to learn from the teachers about what they find effective, rather than the teachers always, necessarily having to go to the research or somebody telling them how to do things better. I think there's a real balance there that could be introduced. So carry on doing what you're doing, I think.
I would really echo that. Nobody knows better than you do what works in your classroom with the children you're working with, and nobody should be telling you. And you shouldn't feel guilty because the curriculum says you should be, or the policy says you should be doing certain things. You shouldn't feel guilty for not doing them because you can't in the circumstances that you're in. So adapt to your local context, and you're the best person to do that. Nobody else can do that.
Oh, thank you very much. And we can maybe end with this last comment from Nufur saying, that is creative teachers really always have what to tell the children, even in the absence of modern technology.
That's absolutely.
100%. Yeah. Thank you very much, Sue. Thank you, Fiona. And if you'd like to know more about this research, about this report, you can see the link in the chat and read more about the findings. So that's it from us for today. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you very much.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for your comments, and thank you for coming.
Bye.
Bye.